In the deepest part of the night, when the world grows quiet and still, there exists a story waiting to be told. A story so old, so layered with mystery and shadow, that even time itself seems to pause when we speak of it. Good evening, dear friends. Tonight, I invite you to settle into comfort as we journey together through the mists of history, to a time when winter itself became a character in one of humanity's most profound trials. Close your eyes if you wish and let your breathing slow. There is no rush. We have all the time in the world. Long ago, in the year that Europeans would come to mark as 1347, something stirred in the distant lands beyond their familiar horizons. It began not with a roar or a warning, but with whispers carried on trading winds and merchants' tailies. These whispers spoke of a sickness, a terrible affliction sweeping through the great cities of the East, moving like an invisible tide through populations that had no name for what was taking them. The merchants who brought these stories arrived in the great port cities of the Mediterranean, Venice, Genoa, Messina, with their ships laden with silks and spices, with precious goods sought by the wealthy and powerful. But hidden within those very vessels, nestled in the dark corners of cargo holds and perhaps even in the fur of small creatures that traveled with the ships, was something far more precious in its power to change the world. Death itself, waiting, patient, ready to begin its terrible journey. The year turned and autumn came to Europe. The leaves fell as they always did, painting the landscapes in shades of amber and rust and deep crimson. Merchants and traders continued their business, unaware of the transformation that was about to unfold. Harvests were brought in, granaries were filled. Families prepared for winter as they had done for countless generations before them. There was no sense of impending catastrophe, no premonition that history itself was about to take a turn that would echo through the centuries, leaving scars upon the collective consciousness of an entire continent. The people of medieval Europe went about their lives, tending to their fields, raising their animals, crafting their goods, engaging in their daily struggles and joys. They had no conception of what was coming, no way to prepare for what cannot be predicted or understood. And then winter arrived. It came as winter always does, with the slow diminishment of light and the gradual creeping of cold across the land. The days grew shorter, the nights grew longer. The world began its annual transformation into a season of scarcity and struggle. In medieval Europe, winter was already a time of hardship, a season when food stores were tested, when animals were brought inside or slaughtered, when the poor faced desperate hunger and cold. Firewood became precious, lighting was scarce and expensive. People huddled together in their homes, in their churches, in their communal spaces, seeking warmth from one another and from whatever fires they could maintain. The vulnerability of humans in winter was profound and real. The body required more food to maintain its warmth. The immune system, though people did not understand it in these terms, was challenged by the cold, by the lack of fresh provisions, by the accumulated stresses of the season. And in this very moment of seasonal weakness, when the human population was at its most fragile and susceptible, when cold and hunger already threatened survival, the sickness arrived. The first records we have speak of symptoms that seemed almost incomprehensible to those who witnessed them. Buboes, terrible, blackened swellings, would appear in the neck, the armpit, the groin. These were not the ordinary illnesses that people recognized and understood from their accumulated experience. These were something entirely new, something that defied explanation and remedy. The fever that accompanied these symptoms burned with an intensity that seemed almost supernatural. The mortality was swift and devastating. Those who contracted the illness would often die within days, sometimes within mere hours. And crucially, the contagion spread with a speed and efficiency that no one understood. People would sicken and die, and then their loved ones who had cared for them would begin to show the same terrible signs. Entire households would be consumed. Communities would watch in horror as their neighbors, their friends, the familiar faces of their daily lives simply vanished, claimed by something they could neither see nor comprehend nor fight. But here is where winter played its crucial role, where the season itself became an instrument of this catastrophe. The cold, you see, did not kill the sickness. It did nothing to stop the plague, for this is what the illness was, what people would eventually come to call the Black Death, the bubonic plague, the most devastating pandemic in human history. No, the cold did not stop it. Instead, the cold changed how it moved through the world, how it reached people, how it took root in communities and populations. In winter, people gathered together more than they did in other seasons. They huddled indoors, seeking warmth. In the cities, the poor were packed into tight quarters, sharing small spaces in narrow buildings, breathing the same air, touching surfaces covered with the invisible vectors of disease. The cold drove them together, and in driving them together, it created perfect conditions for transmission. The plague, we now understand, was carried in multiple ways. It spread through the fleas that lived on rats, yes, but it also spread through the air itself when infected individuals coughed or sneezed or spoke. In the close quarters of winter habitation, in the shared spaces where people gathered for warmth and survival, the plague found an ideal environment. The cold also weakened the human body in ways that made it more vulnerable to severe infection. When resources are scarce, when the body must use substantial energy just to maintain its core temperature, the immune system is strained. The vitamin stores that come from fresh foods are depleted. The vigor of the body is compromised. And into this compromised state came a pathogen of extraordinary virulence. The combination was devastating. People who might have survived a plague in summer, with better nutrition and less crowding, perished in winter. The cold did not create the plague, but it created the conditions under which the plague could move most efficiently, most cruelly, most completely through populations. And there was another element as well, something that people at the time could not have understood, but that we now recognize as crucial. The cold itself, or rather the winter season with its reduced sunlight and its particular environmental conditions, may have also affected the distribution of rats and the behavior of fleas. The fleas that carried the plague in their bodies were more active in certain conditions, more likely to leap from rat to human when temperatures and humidity reached particular thresholds. Winter altered these conditions in ways that either enhanced or reduced transmission in different locations, creating a patchwork of severity across the continent. And so the plague, arriving in Europe just as winter was settling in, found itself in the most favorable possible circumstances for its terrible work. It was as if nature itself had conspired to make the calamity as complete and thorough as possible. The merchants who had brought it, unknowingly, to Mediterranean ports had delivered it at the exact moment when the season would amplify its effects. By the time spring came, by the time the world began to warm and the days began to lengthen, enormous damage had already been done. In cities like Florence, in ports like Venice, in villages across Europe, the cold season had served as the plague's greatest ally. The death toll had already begun to mount into the tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. The mechanisms of society itself were beginning to strain under the weight of so much death. There were not enough people to bury the dead. The usual rituals and rites began to break down under the sheer volume of mortality. And yet, in a terrible irony, as spring approached and the weather warmed, many people perhaps hoped that the crisis would pass, that the sickness would diminish, that the worst was behind them. But the plague, having established itself so firmly during the winter, having created such vast reservoirs of infection within the rat population and within human communities, did not diminish. It continued, and in many places it intensified through the spring and summer months. The initial gift of winter, the amplification of transmission through cold and crowding, had done its work, had allowed the plague to establish itself so deeply that it would persist for years to come. The winter of 1347 to 1348 thus stands as a kind of hinge point in history, a moment when the season itself became intertwined with human catastrophe. The cold did not cause the plague, but the cold determined how the plague would move through the world, determined how many people would fall ill, and determined the shape of the tragedy that would unfold. It is a sobering reminder of how intimately human fate is connected to the natural world, to the cycles of season and weather, to the forces that we live within and among. The people of medieval Europe could not have known any of this. They could not have understood the microscopic mechanism by which fleas carried bacteria, or the way that close winter quarters amplified transmission, or the manner in which cold and hunger weakened the body's defenses. They only knew what they experienced. The arrival of a sickness unlike anything in their experience, the rapid spread of this sickness through their communities, the absolute helplessness in the face of death on such a vast and impersonal scale. And they felt, perhaps, something that we can still recognize and empathize with, the sense that nature itself had turned against them, that the familiar cycles that had governed their lives had suddenly become instruments of destruction. As we settle deeper into our own night, into our own comfort and safety, we might reflect on how much has changed and how little. We now understand the mechanisms of disease transmission. We have technologies and medicines that the people of the 14th century could not have imagined. And yet, we too live in intimate relationships with the natural world. with seasons and cycles and invisible forces that move through our communities. We too experience moments when we suddenly recognize how fragile our certainties are, how quickly the familiar can become dangerous. The story of the Black Death beginning in winter, made worse by the cold, is a story about human vulnerability and human resilience, about the way that catastrophe arrives without warning and changes everything. It is a story about winter itself, about that season of darkness and cold and gathering inward, a season that has shaped human experience since before written history. As you lie there, warm and safe, in your own comfortable shelter, perhaps you can feel a kind of gratitude for the protections that surround you, for the knowledge and the medicine and the systems that separate you from the vulnerabilities that your ancestors faced. Sleep now, knowing that we are here, warm and safe on this side of history. As the narrative deepens and we move further into this historical journey, let us turn our attention to the specific mechanisms by which winter made the plague's progression so much more severe. Imagine, if you will, the texture of daily life in a medieval city as autumn turned to winter. The streets, which in warmer months might have been places of movement and relative dispersal, began to empty. People spent more time indoors, in the crowded tenements that housed the poor, in the guild halls where craftsmen worked, in the monasteries and convents where religious communities lived in close proximity to one another. The architecture of medieval cities was such that space was precious and densely packed. In the poorer quarters, families might share rooms with extended relatives, with servants, with apprentices. The concept of personal space, of isolation during illness, was largely unknown and would have been impossible to practice given the constraints of daily life and survival. When someone fell ill, they did not retreat to a separate room to recover in solitude. They remained among their family members, their housemates, the people with whom they shared their living space. And in winter, when the cold was intense and deadly in its own right, when warmth was a precious commodity that people huddled together to obtain, the opportunities for close contact multiplied exponentially. The rats that carried the plague, the black rats that lived in the holds of ships and in the grain stores and in the walls of buildings, also sought warmth as winter approached. They too gathered together, clustering in the dark, warm spaces where food was stored or where humans lived. The fleas that lived on these rats, tiny creatures that seemed insignificant in the grand scheme of things, were themselves affected by temperature and humidity. In the warmth of human habitations during winter, in the packed spaces where people and rats existed in close proximity, the fleas thrived. They fed, they reproduced, they jumped from rat to human, and from human to human, with an efficiency that they would not have achieved in warmer months when people might have spent more time outdoors. The seasonal migration patterns of rats shifted with the approach of winter. The same instinct that drove humans indoors drove rats indoors as well. They came seeking shelter in the very buildings where humans sought the same refuge. And in these shared spaces, the plague found a pathway from animal to human that was almost irresistible. But beyond these biological mechanisms, there was another layer to how winter amplified the plague's devastation. The psychological and social effects of the season cannot be overlooked. Winter in medieval Europe was a time of anxiety even in the best of circumstances. The stores of grain had to last until spring. If they ran out, starvation would follow. The poor faced genuine danger of freezing to death if they did not have adequate fuel for fire. The elderly and the very young were particularly vulnerable. There was a kind of collective holding of breath that happened each winter, waiting to see if the community would survive, until spring brought new growth and new food sources. Into this existing state of anxiety and vulnerability, the plague arrived with its swift and terrible mortality. People were already stressed, already worried, already experiencing the strain of the season. The appearance of the plague did not create a state of calm reassessment. Instead, it intensified the existing anxiety and added to it something far more terrible: the unknown threat that could not be defended against through prudence or preparation. The cold also meant that people were wearing more clothing, wearing heavier fabrics that covered more of their bodies. Paradoxically, this may have made the transmission of fleas from person to person easier in some circumstances, as the fleas could hide in the folds of heavy cloaks and blankets that people wrapped themselves in for warmth. The very adaptations that people made to survive the winter, the bundling up, the gathering together, the sharing of blankets and cloaks, the pressing close to one another for warmth, all of these things made them more vulnerable to the plague. The cold defeated its own purpose, in a sense. The very mechanisms by which humans sought to protect themselves from the cold became mechanisms through which the plague could spread. And the people of the time, of course, did not understand this. They could not have known that the practices that seemed most essential for survival during winter were also the practices that facilitated the transmission of disease. They only knew what they experienced: that the sickness spread fastest in winter, that the mortality was most severe in the cold months, that spring seemed to offer some respite even though it did not bring an end to the plague. They developed theories based on what they observed, theories that seem to us now to be based on misunderstanding. They spoke of corrupted air, of miasmas, of planetary alignments that might explain the spread of disease. These theories were not the result of foolishness, but of a sincere attempt to make sense of something that defied their existing frameworks of understanding. And there was also the element of human behavior that changed with the season. In winter, people gathered in churches more frequently, seeking spiritual comfort in the face of hardship and uncertainty. The church was a gathering place, a source of warmth, a place where people came together to pray for survival through the season and through whatever threats they faced. The clergy, moving between communities, tending to the sick and the dying, performing last rites and burials, became vectors for the transmission of the plague. They were exposed to the disease at higher rates than the general population, and as they moved from place to place, they carried it with them. In many communities, the clergy died almost as rapidly as the lay population, and in some places, the death rate among priests was even higher because of their particular role in ministering to the sick and the dying. The very institutions and practices that people turned to for comfort and spiritual sustenance in times of crisis became channels for the transmission of plague. This was another cruel irony of the situation, another way in which the efforts of people to help one another, to maintain their communities and their spiritual practices during the hardship of winter, actually contributed to the spread of the disease. The supply chains that fed medieval cities were also disrupted by the arrival of winter and the subsequent plague. In autumn, supplies were brought in to sustain the cities through the winter. But as plague deaths mounted, as fear spread, as people began to understand that something terrible was happening, the normal flow of commerce began to break down. Merchants became reluctant to travel to plague-stricken cities. Farmers and villagers, seeing the death and devastation in urban centers, became reluctant to bring their goods to market. The supplies that were essential for surviving the winter began to run short. And as food supplies became scarce, the nutritional status of the population declined further, weakening their ability to fight off infection. The cold that required more calories, the fear and stress that accompanied the plague, the disruption of supply chains, and the resulting malnutrition created a cascade of vulnerabilities. Each element reinforced and intensified the others. The cold made people need food, but the plague disrupted the supply of food. The fear and stress of the plague reduced people's ability to fight off infection, but malnutrition and the cold both contributed to stress on the body. It was a vicious circle, with winter as one of the key elements that kept the circle turning. We might also consider the matter of medical care and the attempts that people made to treat the sick. In winter, with supplies scarce and conditions difficult, even the limited medical care that was available became harder to provide. Physicians, few as they were reluctant to visit plague patients, as the disease seemed to be spread by contact. The herbs and remedies that were thought to have medicinal properties were less available in winter, with fresh plants dormant or dead. The treatments that people attempted, bloodletting, the application of poultices, the burning of aromatic woods to purify the air, were largely ineffective against the plague and may have actually hastened death in some cases. But in the absence of understanding of the true cause of the disease, these were the responses that seemed reasonable. And in winter, when the cold itself was a constant threat, when maintaining basic hygiene and cleanliness was difficult, when water had to be heated for warmth rather than reserved for washing, the conditions under which the plague thrived were not merely maintained, but actively amplified. The very practices that might have offered some small degree of protection in other circumstances became impossible to maintain. The body's natural defenses were weakened by cold and malnutrition. The environmental conditions favored the transmission of the disease. The social and economic disruptions that the plague caused were intensified by the season. And the psychological toll of enduring both winter and plague together was profound and lasting. Let us imagine the experience of a single family in a European city as winter deepened and the plague spread. Perhaps we can place ourselves in Florence, a great city of wealth and culture, or in Venice, a city of merchants and traders. It is November, and the first reports of plague have arrived. There is uncertainty, some skepticism. Surely people think this plague from distant lands will not reach so far. Surely the city's prosperity and the skills of its physicians will protect them. But by December, cases have been confirmed in the city. People who were alive and walking the streets a few days ago are now dead. The reality begins to set in. The cold deepens. The days grow shorter. The city grows quieter as people spend more time indoors. Stores close or operate with fewer workers. The joy that might normally accompany the December season, the preparations for Christmas and the winter holidays, are muted and shadowed by fear. By January, the deaths are mounting daily. The bells that ring to announce deaths become almost constant. The city begins to smell of death, a terrible odor that seems to seep from the ground itself, from the mass graves that are dug to accommodate the bodies. The cold is so intense that the ground is frozen, making burial more difficult. Bodies begin to pile up faster than they can be interred. The social order that holds a city together begins to strain and crack under the weight of so much death. People abandon their shops, their work, their normal responsibilities to tend to sick family members or to prepare for their own illness. Many families lose multiple members in the course of a few days. A household that had 5 or 6 people might be reduced to 1 or 2 survivors, and those survivors might themselves already be showing signs of illness. The winter of 1347 to 1348 stretched on, as all winters do, but it must have seemed endless to those enduring it. Each day brought new deaths. Each morning brought new fear. The cold that had seemed merely inconvenient in November, merely difficult in December, became by January and February a backdrop to an apocalyptic unfolding. Some records suggest that in some cities, up to a half or even more of the population died during that first winter of plague. To lose half of everyone around you in the course of a few months is an experience so traumatic, so utterly world-altering, that it is difficult for us, living in a very different age, to fully comprehend the psychological impact. The survivors were not grateful to have lived. Many of them felt survivors' guilt, felt that they had escaped through luck or fate, while others, often better and kinder people, had been claimed by the disease. The trust that people had in the social order, in the church, in authority, was shattered. If the church could not protect them, if the priests died along with everyone else, what good was religion? If the physicians could not cure the disease, if they themselves often died first from it, what good was knowledge or learning? If the wealthy were not protected by their wealth, if merchants died just as readily as the poor, what was the meaning of social hierarchy? These were not abstract philosophical questions, but immediate existential crises. And through all of this, the winter continued. The cold did not relent. The dark did not diminish until its own natural cycle brought it to an end. Spring came slowly, grudgingly, as it always does in temperate climates. The days began to lengthen. The cold began, incrementally, to loosen its grip. and people emerged from their houses, if they were still alive to emerge, to find a world that had been transformed beyond recognition. Entire quarters of cities were empty of people. Fields lay untended because there were not enough living people to work them. Social relationships had been permanently altered by the deaths of so many. Families had been decimated. Economic structures had been disrupted. The world seemed to have ended, and yet it had not. Life continued, but it was a different life, a life lived in the shadow of the catastrophe. What we see, then, in the arrival of the Black Death during winter in Europe is not merely the intersection of biology and season, though it certainly was that. We see the collision of multiple systems: biological, social, economic, psychological, all amplified and intensified by the particular vulnerabilities that winter creates. The cold did not cause the plague, but it determined how the plague would move through European populations, determine the speed of transmission, and determine the scale of the catastrophe. And in determining these things, winter became forever linked with one of the greatest traumas in human history. The two are inseparable in our historical understanding. When we speak of the Black Death beginning in winter, we are not merely noting a coincidence of dates. We are acknowledging that the season itself was a participant in the unfolding tragedy, a force that shaped how the plague moved through the world and affected human communities. As we settle deeper into this narrative, let us turn our attention to the specific ways in which the biology of the plague itself was altered and amplified by the cold season. The disease, we now understand, was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. This organism is extraordinarily efficient at spreading through populations, and it exists in multiple forms, each with its own particular characteristics and modes of transmission. The bubonic form, which was the most common manifestation during the initial outbreak, spread primarily through the bite of infected fleas. The pneumonic form, which attacks the lungs and respiratory system, spreads through the air from person to person. And there was also a septicemic form, which entered the bloodstream directly and was often rapidly fatal. All three forms were present during the winter of 1347 to 1348, and all three were affected by the cold in ways that either accelerated or modified their spread through human populations. Consider for a moment the flea itself, that tiny creature that was instrumental in carrying the plague from rat to human. The flea, like all living things, is affected by temperature. In warmer weather, fleas are active, hungry, and motivated to seek blood meals. They leap readily from host to host, searching for warmth and sustenance. In colder weather, fleas become less active, their metabolism slows, and their behavior changes. One might think, therefore, that cold would slow the spread of plague by reducing flea activity, and in some circumstances, this may have been true. But in the specific conditions of medieval winter, in the warm buildings where people and rats huddled together, the situation was reversed. The fleas found themselves in an environment that was, from their perspective, ideal. They had shelter from the cold. They had access to hosts, both human and rat, in abundance. They had a warm microclimate created by the bodies of humans and animals pressed together for warmth. In these conditions, fleas thrived. They fed more frequently because of the concentration of hosts. They reproduced more rapidly because conditions favored their reproduction. And critically, when a flea fed on an infected rat and then sought another host, it was more likely to encounter a human in the crowded indoor spaces of winter than it would have been in the more dispersed environments of warmer seasons. The bacteria itself, Yersinia pestis, is also affected by temperature and humidity, though in ways that are complex and sometimes counterintuitive. The bacteria can survive for periods in the external environment, in soil, or in the bodies of dead rats, but it survives better in certain conditions than in others. Winter's cold does not kill the bacteria outright, but it does slow its reproduction and metabolism. However, in the warm environments created by human habitation in winter, the bacteria found conditions that were more favorable for transmission from one host to another. The bacteria would multiply in the body of an infected flea, creating a blockage in the flea's digestive system. This blockage caused the flea to regurgitate bacteria into the bloodstream of its host when it fed, creating a highly efficient mechanism for transmission. In winter, with the concentration of hosts and the abundance of fleas, this mechanism worked with devastating efficiency. The bacteria moved from rat to flea to human with a speed that must have seemed supernatural to those observing it. The pneumonic form of the plague, which spreads through the air, was also particularly effective in winter conditions. When an infected person coughs or sneezes, they release tiny droplets containing the bacteria into the air around them. In summer, in environments where people spend time outdoors or in well-ventilated spaces, these droplets disperse relatively quickly and are less likely to be inhaled by others. But in winter, when people are crowded together in poorly ventilated buildings, when they are sitting close to one another for warmth, when they are sharing the same enclosed air for hours or even days at a time, the pneumonic form of the plague finds ideal conditions for spread. A single infected individual could potentially infect multiple people in the course of a day or two in these circumstances. The respiratory form of the plague, once established in a community through flea transmission, could then spread with terrifying speed through the air itself. It was this combination, the flea-borne bubonic form establishing itself during the close quarters of winter, followed by the pneumonic form spreading through the air in the same crowded environments, that created the perfect storm of transmission. And there was another element related to the seasonality of plague transmission, something that relates to the particular life cycle of the rat population itself. The brown rat, which would later become more common in Europe, had not yet arrived during the 14th century. The plague was carried primarily by the black rat, a species that was more commonly found in the warmer regions, and that had arrived in Europe through the merchant ships that traveled the Mediterranean trade routes. The black rat is sensitive to cold. In winter, it seeks shelter in the warmth of human habitations. It does not hibernate in the way that some other rodents do, but it becomes less active and spends more time in the warm shelters it has found. This seasonal behavior of the rat population meant that in winter, the reservoir of infected rats was concentrated in human buildings, in granaries, in homes, in the very places where human populations were also concentrated for warmth. The geographical proximity of infected rats and vulnerable humans was thus at its maximum during winter. In warmer seasons, rats might roam more widely, spreading out across fields and forests, with less overlap between their habitats and human habitations. But in winter, they were forced together with humans in the same enclosed spaces. The plague, traveling in the bodies of fleas living on these rats, traveled with them into the human population. Let us consider now the matter of immunity and the state of the human body as winter progresses. The medieval population, like all populations, had some individuals who possessed natural resistance to plague, who had genetic or acquired characteristics that made them less likely to succumb to infection. But many people had no such resistance. And critically, in winter, the general health status of the population was declining. The stores of fresh food that would have been abundant in summer and autumn were depleted. The bread and stored grains that provided the bulk of winter calories lacked the vitamins and nutrients that fresh produce provides. Vitamin C deficiency, leading to scurvy, was not uncommon in winter. The lack of sunlight meant that vitamin D production in the skin was reduced. These nutritional deficiencies, while perhaps not immediately life-threatening on their own, made the body less able to mount an effective immune response. When the plague bacterium entered the body, the immune system had to fight back. But an immune system that was already stressed by malnutrition, by cold, by the general strain of winter survival, was less effective than it would have been in other seasons. The cold itself also stressed the body in ways that compromised immune function. The body must use energy to maintain its core temperature in the face of external cold. In medieval times, this energy came from the food that people ate, and that food was in limited supply in winter. The body, faced with the dual demand of maintaining warmth and fighting infection, had to make choices about how to allocate its limited resources. Often, the result was that immune function was compromised in favor of maintaining core body temperature. This is a fundamental principle of survival physiology. Maintaining core body temperature takes priority because without it, death comes rapidly. But this priority, while ensuring short-term survival in the cold, made people more vulnerable to infectious disease. The very adaptations that helped people survive winter made them more vulnerable to plague. There is also evidence, though it is more contested by modern scholars, that the plague itself may have been affected by the cold in ways that influenced its virulence and mortality. The cold may have selected for particularly virulent strains of the bacteria, strains that were more effective at transmission in the specific conditions of winter. The bacteria, like all organisms, exists in varieties and populations. Some variants might be more aggressive, causing more severe disease but spreading more rapidly. Others might be less severe but slower to spread. In the concentrated populations of winter, in the conditions of intense transmission created by the cold and crowding, the more aggressive and more transmissible variants would have had an advantage. They would infect more people, reproduce more rapidly, and thus become more prevalent in the population. This process of selection for virulence would have been accelerated during the winter months when transmission was most intense. By the time spring came and conditions changed, the plague population within Europe had been selected for particular characteristics that made it especially suited to rapid transmission. This may explain why the plague did not diminish as spring arrived and as outdoor living resumed, as one might have expected if the only factor in transmission was winter crowding. The psychological effects of being sick during winter added another layer to the tragedy. A person who fell ill in summer might expect that the sunshine, the fresh air, and the abundance of foods might aid recovery. These things, while not true medicines, represented hope. A person who fell ill in winter, who lay feverish and delirious in a dark room with only a smoky fire for light and warmth, experienced the illness in a context of complete bleakness. There was nothing to suggest recovery or hope. The world outside was cold and dark and hostile. The body was racked with fever and pain. The symptoms of the plague, the buboes, the blackened extremities, the hemorrhagic manifestations, were terrifying and obviously progressing toward death. Many people, once they understood that they had the plague, seemed to have given up hope almost immediately. And surrender to despair, while emotionally understandable, also seems to have had physiological consequences. The stress hormones that the body produces in response to fear and hopelessness suppress immune function further. The will to live, which is not merely a poetic concept but has real physiological effects on recovery, was undermined by the apparent inevitability of death. Let us think now about the practical realities of caring for the sick during winter plague. In a modern hospital, an infected patient is isolated in a separate room, away from other patients and from healthy people. The medical staff who care for them wear protective equipment and follow strict protocols to prevent transmission. Nothing of the sort was possible in medieval Europe. When a family member fell ill with plague, they remained in the family home, in the crowded quarters shared with other family members. There were no protective barriers. There were no protocols. People approached the sick from compassion and from duty, touching them, trying to comfort them, attempting to administer whatever remedies they thought might help. In doing so, they exposed themselves to the disease. Caregivers, particularly those who were already weakened by the stresses of winter, often fell ill themselves within days of caring for a plague patient. The very act of compassion, of attempting to help one's family members, often resulted in one's own death. This created a terrible moral weight for the survivors. Did your attempt to help cause your family member to fall ill? Are you responsible for their death? These guilt-laden questions haunted survivors, adding psychological trauma to the physical survival of the plague. The medical theories of the time, while not correct in their specifics, did contain observations that were accurate in their own way. The physicians of the time believed in the theory of miasmas, corrupted air, as a cause of disease. This theory was wrong in its fundamental assumption, but it led to some practical consequences that were not entirely unhelpful. If disease was caused by corrupted air, then fresh air was the cure. This led some people to spend time outdoors despite the cold, or to open windows and doors to ventilate their homes, regardless of the cold. While this did not cure plague, it may have had some beneficial effects in reducing the concentration of the plague bacillus in the air around sick individuals, or in reducing the number of fleas that could survive in such environments. Additionally, the belief in miasmas led to attempts to purify the air by burning aromatic woods and herbs. While this did not kill the plague bacterium, the smoke and heat may have had some effect on the flea population, or at least gave people a sense of agency and action in the face of the plague, which itself had psychological benefits. The theories were wrong, but some of the practical consequences of acting on these theories had minor beneficial effects. The winter also affected the movement of people and goods in ways that shaped how the plague spread. In spring and summer, people and goods move more freely. Merchants travel longer distances. People migrate seasonally in search of work or opportunity. But in winter, this movement was reduced. The roads were harder to travel. The weather made journeys dangerous. Many people who would have traveled in other seasons remained in their home communities for the winter. This meant that the plague, once established in a particular location, remained more concentrated in that location during winter. It did not spread as rapidly across the landscape as it might have in other seasons. But within each location, it spread intensely, affecting a higher percentage of the local population before moving on. In spring, when travel resumed, the plague traveled with the merchants and migrants who ventured out from plague-stricken communities. The concentrated infection of winter thus became the seed for the spread of plague across Europe in the spring and summer months. The winter, with its relative immobility and its intense local transmission, was thus the crucial foundation upon which the continent-wide plague was built. There is also evidence that the mortality rates varied somewhat with the specific characteristics of different winters. Winters that were particularly cold and long, that delayed the arrival of spring, tended to show higher plague mortality in the regions affected. Winters that were less severe, that allowed some outdoor activity and some relief from the intense crowding, sometimes showed somewhat lower rates of transmission, though the plague still spread inexorably. This suggests that the cold itself was not merely coincidental to the plague, but was actively shaping its progression. The biological processes of the disease, the behavior of the vectors of transmission, the health status of the human population, the social behaviors that people adopted in response to the cold. All of these things were altered and intensified by the season. Winter was not merely a backdrop to the plague. Winter was an active participant in the plague, shaping how it moved and how deadly it was. As we continue to contemplate this history, we might reflect on the cascade of biological and social consequences that flowed from the fact that the plague arrived in Europe in autumn and established itself during winter. Had the plague arrived in spring, had it established itself during a season of relative outdoor activity and dispersal, the trajectory of the pandemic might have been very different. There would likely have been fewer deaths in the first year. The social disruption might have been less severe. The trauma to European consciousness might have been less profound. But the plague arrived in the season it did, and winter amplified its effects in ways that echoed through the centuries. The winter of 1347 to 1348 thus stands as a hinge point not merely in the history of disease, but in the history of European consciousness, a moment when the natural world, through the mechanism of seasonal cold, participated in the transformation of human history. As we move deeper into our contemplation of this historical moment, let us shift our focus to the lived experience of communities during this terrible winter, to the ways in which the cold and the plague transformed not just individual lives, but the very fabric of social organization. Imagine the streets of a medieval city as December deepens. The architecture of these cities was such that the poor and the wealthy often lived in close proximity, though in dramatically different conditions. The wealthy occupied larger houses, often with multiple rooms, and the means to heat them with expensive fuel. The poor lived in cramped quarters, often in the upper stories of tenement buildings where heat rose from the lower levels, but where the cold still seeped through gaps in walls and floors. As winter deepened, the contrast between these living conditions became starker and more cruel. The wealthy might retreat into their heated chambers, surrounding themselves with braziers and fires, with wine and stored foods, with whatever comforts their wealth could purchase. The poor huddled together in their crowded spaces, sharing what little fuel they had, rationing their stores of food, enduring cold that must have seemed almost unbearable. The plague, in its terrible democracy, affected both rich and poor, but it affected them differently. The wealthy, with their larger spaces and their ability to retreat from public contact, might have had slightly better chances of avoiding infection than the poor crowded into tenements. But once infected, the wealthy were no more immune to the disease than anyone else. Indeed, in some cases, the wealthy may have fared worse because they often had access to the physicians of the time, who attempted treatments that were not merely ineffective but actively harmful. Bloodletting was a common treatment, based on the theory that disease was caused by an imbalance of humors in the body. A patient would be opened with a lance, and blood would be drawn out in the hope of restoring balance. For someone already weakened by fever and infection, this loss of blood could accelerate the progress toward death. The physicians, in their attempts to help, may have hastened the deaths of some of their wealthy patients who could afford to pay for their services. The poor, unable to access physicians, relied on folk remedies, on prayer, on the ministries of midwives and herbalists. Some of these remedies were useless, but at least they did no active harm. The cold itself created a secondary crisis that ran parallel to the plague. As winter progressed, fuel for heating became scarce and expensive. The poor, already on the margins of survival, faced genuine danger of freezing to death. Some records suggest that in severe winters, the death toll from cold itself could rival or exceed the death toll from plague in certain regions. A person weakened by cold and hunger is extraordinarily vulnerable to infection, and a person sick with plague, deprived of adequate heat because of poverty, would likely die more rapidly than someone with access to warmth and comfort. The cold and the plague thus interacted in multiple ways, each making the other more deadly. The systems that broke down under the weight of plague mortality were the same systems that were essential for surviving winter. When workers died, when the normal patterns of commerce were disrupted, when people were too terrified or too sick to engage in their usual occupations, the supply of fuel for heating was disrupted. Woodcutters died or abandoned their work. Merchants were unwilling to travel the dangerous roads to bring fuel to cities. The price of fuel skyrocketed, becoming unaffordable to the poor even as the necessity for it became more urgent. Let us consider the particular challenge faced by those whose occupation it was to care for the dying and to dispose of the dead. The gravediggers, the sextons, the priests who performed last rites, the nurses and attendants who cared for plague patients. These individuals were exposed to the plague at rates far higher than the general population. Many of them fell ill and died. As their numbers dwindled, the remaining individuals faced an impossible burden. The dead accumulated faster than they could be buried. In some cities, mass graves were dug. Bodies were deposited in them with minimal ceremony, stacked on top of one another without the individual burials that had been the norm. In winter, when the ground was frozen, the digging of graves became extraordinarily difficult. Picks and shovels struck frozen earth and bounced back. The work was slow and exhausting. In some places, bodies were deposited in areas outside the city walls without proper burial, left to the elements and to scavengers. The psychological impact of this on the survivors cannot be overstated. In medieval Christian culture, the proper burial of the dead was seen as essential for the salvation of the soul. To see the dead treated with such disrespect, to have loved ones deposited in mass graves without ceremony, was a spiritual crisis as well as a psychological trauma. The church, which should have been a source of comfort and spiritual guidance during the crisis, was itself overwhelmed and demoralized. The clergy died at rates comparable to or even exceeding the rates of the general population. They were exposed to the plague through their ministry to the sick and dying. They were also affected by the same deprivations of food and fuel that affected everyone else. In some regions, so many priests died that there were not enough living clergy to perform the basic rites of the church. Masses could not be said because there were no priests to say them. Last rites could not be administered because the priests were dead or too sick to minister. The confessional could not function. The religious rituals that people turned to in times of crisis were simply not available. This absence of religious comfort intensified the spiritual crisis that accompanied the plague. If God had abandoned them, if the church could not help them, then what meaning did life have? Some records suggest that faith actually declined during the plague in certain regions, that people became more skeptical of religion rather than more devout. Others suggest the opposite, that some people turned to even more intense religious devotion, to flagellant movements, to extreme asceticism, as if they could somehow atone for the sins that must have brought this catastrophe upon them. The winter also created particular hardships for those whose work required them to be outdoors or to move between communities. The soldiers, such as they were, who might have been called upon to maintain order, became sick and died like everyone else. The messengers who carried communications between cities faced not only the plague, but the dangers of travel in winter weather. The trade routes that were essential to the economic functioning of medieval Europe were disrupted. Ships did not sail in winter, or sailed less frequently, and the plague spread rapidly through port cities, making merchants reluctant to venture to plague-stricken ports. The economic systems of medieval Europe, which were already fragile and largely based on barter and local exchange, rather than on complex trade networks, began to break down. This economic disruption had immediate consequences for the ability of cities and regions to function. Without the goods from trade, without the normal flow of commerce, communities began to turn inward, to focus on simple survival rather than on the maintenance of the complex social structures that held society together. The winter also affected how the plague was perceived and how people responded to it psychologically. In summer, when people are outdoors and engaging in activity, a disease that kills rapidly might be seen as a kind of divine judgment, swift and comprehensible. But in winter, when darkness comes early and people are already isolated indoors, when the natural world is already displaying death and dormancy, a plague that spreads through the cold months takes on a quality of inevitability, of a kind of natural order gone terribly wrong. The winter darkness amplified the sense of doom and despair. The long nights gave people time to contemplate their mortality, to worry about their own vulnerability, to grieve for those they had already lost. The daylight hours were short and insufficient for normal work, so people's attention turned inward to their fears and anxieties, rather than outward to productive activity that might have distracted them or given them a sense of agency. There is also evidence that the winter affected how different regions experienced the plague with different severity. Regions with harsher winters, particularly those in northern Europe, sometimes experience somewhat different patterns of plague transmission than regions with milder winters. In regions where extreme cold might have killed off more of the flea population or forced more complete hibernation on the rat population, the transmission might have been interrupted seasonally. But even in these regions, the plague still established itself and spread. It merely did so with a somewhat different temporal pattern. The winter was never an ally to human populations attempting to survive the plague, but in different regions, the particular characteristics of the winter, its severity, its duration, its effect on the local ecology, shaped how the plague progressed. Let us also consider the matter of social control and governance during this period. The civic authorities of medieval cities, already struggling to maintain order in societies where law enforcement was minimal and authority was often challenged, faced an unprecedented crisis with the arrival of plague. Some cities attempted to implement quarantine measures, preventing travel between infected and uninfected areas. Some attempted to enforce hygiene measures or to restrict the movement of the poor, whom they feared might spread disease. These attempts at public health governance were often ineffective and sometimes counterproductive. Quarantine was difficult to enforce in winter when people needed to move to find food and fuel. Restrictions on the movement of the poor often created humanitarian crises, trapping people in plague-stricken areas without the resources to survive. The authorities, operating with incomplete understanding of how the plague spread, often implemented measures that seemed logical at the time, but were ineffective or harmful in their actual consequences. Some cities also witnessed what we might call social breakdown, a collapse of the normal rules and hierarchies that governed society. In some places, servants abandoned their masters, seeking safety elsewhere. Workers refused to work, demanding higher wages as their labor became scarce. In some communities, the normal rules about property and inheritance were suspended or ignored as people focused on immediate survival. Looters took advantage of the chaos to steal from the dead and the dying. Some records describe scenes of nearly complete social dissolution, where the normal bonds that held communities together simply ceased to function. Other communities seemed to maintain more cohesion, with people continuing to follow social hierarchies and traditional patterns even as death ravaged their population. The difference between communities that maintained social order and those that experienced social dissolution seems to have been related to the strength of existing authority structures, to the particular character of local leadership, and to cultural factors that we cannot fully reconstruct from the historical record. The winter also shaped how the plague affected family structures and kinship networks. In peacetime, families often extended across multiple generations living in proximity to one another, with complex patterns of obligation and support. The plague struck so swiftly and so widely that these family networks were often shattered in the course of a few weeks. Entire families were wiped out, with no survivors to inherit property or to carry on the family name. In other cases, some family members survived while others did not, creating strange new family configurations and inheritance situations that the existing legal structures had never been designed to handle. Children were orphaned, sometimes with no relatives available to care for them. Widows were left without the support structures that they had relied upon. The old were left without children to care for them in their final years. The social consequences of these disrupted family networks reverberated through generations, affecting the structure of communities and societies for decades to come. There is also the matter of how the winter affected the migration patterns of survivors and the movement of the plague itself across Europe. As spring arrived and the roads became more passable, surviving merchants and refugees began to travel, seeking to escape plague-stricken areas and to re-establish their lives in new places. In doing so, they carried the plague with them. A person who had been exposed to plague in Florence, who had survived infection, or who had harbored the infection without showing severe symptoms, could travel to Rome or Venice or elsewhere and introduce the plague into new communities. The concentrated infection of winter in particular regions thus became the source from which the plague spread across Europe in the following spring and summer. The winter, with its tendency to concentrate populations and infections in particular places, had created the conditions under which the plague could spread continent-wide in the subsequent seasons. The winter also affected how the plague would be remembered and how it would enter into European consciousness and culture. The trauma of the plague, intensified by the horror of experiencing it during the cold and darkness of winter, left deep marks on the European psyche. The iconography that emerged from this period, images of death, of skeletons and decay, of the dance macabre, reflects this winter trauma. The winter amplified the visual and psychological horror of the plague. A summer plague, with its dead stacked in mass graves under sunny skies, might have been perceived differently. But a winter plague, with the landscape already gray and dead, with darkness falling by mid-afternoon, with the cold itself seeming like an ally of death, created a particular flavor of horror that dominated European cultural memory for centuries. As we venture deeper into this narrative of winter and plague, let us now consider the economic consequences that flowed from this collision of season and disease, for the disruption to trade, to labor, to the fundamental systems by which communities fed and sustained themselves, was as devastating in its own way as the direct mortality from the plague itself. Imagine the world of medieval commerce as it existed in the autumn of 1347. The great trading cities of the Mediterranean, Venice, Genoa, and the ports of southern Italy, were the nerve centers of a vast network that stretched eastward to Constantinople, to the Black Sea, to the spice routes of Asia. These cities were built on trade, and their wealth flowed from the movement of goods along these routes. Merchants were preparing for the winter slowdown, bringing in supplies, completing transactions before the season made travel difficult. The ships that carried these goods were being hauled up for winter storage, or were undertaking final voyages before the sailing season ended. It was a time of activity and commerce, but also of the natural downturn that came with approaching winter. The plague's arrival in these port cities in late 1347 threw this delicate system into immediate chaos. The ships that carried the plague's vectors, the rats and fleas, arrived in ports where they discharged their cargo and where they spread disease to the human population. But the arrival of the plague also created fear, which in itself disrupted commerce. Merchants from uninfected cities became reluctant to visit plague-stricken ports. The goods that normally flowed through these centers began to back up, unable to be transported. Some cities attempted to impose quarantines, requiring ships to remain offshore for a period before being allowed to dock. These measures, while well-intentioned and based on observation that plague seemed to travel with merchandise and merchants, had the effect of further disrupting trade. Goods rotted in holds. Perishables spoiled. The commercial networks that had taken centuries to develop began to strain under the weight of the plague's disruptions. The winter intensified all of these disruptions. In normal times, winter already reduced maritime trade to a fraction of its summer levels. Ships were taken out of service. Merchants focused on transactions that could be completed locally rather than on long-distance trade. But in the winter of 1347 to 1348, winter trade disruptions coincided with plague-driven disruptions. The two forces combined to create an almost complete cessation of long-distance commerce in many regions. The merchant networks that connected Europe to the East simply ceased to function. For the first time in generations, the flow of exotic goods that had been the lifeblood of medieval commerce dried up almost completely. This had implications that extended far beyond the mere inconvenience of wealthy merchants missing their spices and silks. The entire financial system of medieval Europe was built on this trade. Wealthy merchants financed other enterprises, funded military campaigns, supported the arts and learning. When their wealth was disrupted by the cessation of trade, the entire social order that depended on their patronage began to strain. But even more immediately pressing was the disruption to food supplies. Medieval cities, particularly large ones like Florence, Venice, Milan, and Paris, were not self-sufficient in food production. They depended on grain brought in from surrounding agricultural regions, on preserved foods from trade networks, on the constant flow of supplies from the countryside. The winter always strained these supply systems, as stored food had to be carefully rationed to last until the next harvest. But in the winter of 1347 to 1348, the systems broke down more completely than they had in living memory. The plague killed workers in the countryside just as it killed workers in the cities. Farmers fell ill and died. The harvest of autumn had been completed, but the distribution and transport of grain to cities was disrupted by deaths among merchants, by fear that led people to hoard food rather than trade it, by the simple fact that normal commerce was ceasing to function. In some cities, grain stores began to run short by late January or February. The prospect of starvation began to shadow the already grim reality of plague deaths. The combination of plague death and potential starvation created a crisis that threatened the very functioning of urban life. In some cities, social order began to break down as people focused on securing food for their own survival, rather than on maintaining their normal occupations and social roles. Records from this period describe scenes of riots over food, of hoarding and black markets, of wealthy merchants and nobility attempting to secure supplies while the poor faced genuine hunger. Some cities were forced to attempt emergency measures, importing grain from distant regions at enormous expense, or distributing stored reserves to prevent starvation. But these measures were often insufficient, and in some cities, starvation began to claim lives even as the plague continued its deadly work. A person weakened by hunger is extraordinarily vulnerable to infectious disease. Someone who was malnourished during winter would likely be less able to survive plague infection than someone who was well fed. The combination of malnutrition and plague created a cascade of deaths that exceeded what would have occurred from either factor alone. The disruption to food supplies also had social consequences that extended beyond the immediate winter. In medieval Europe, part of the social contract between peasants and the nobility was that the nobility would provide protection and ensure access to land and subsistence. But in the face of the plague, the nobility often proved unable to fulfill this bargain. They fled plague-stricken areas just as readily as anyone else, sometimes leaving their lands and peasants to fend for themselves. When spring came and the plague began to slow, surviving peasants found themselves in a new position. There were fewer of them, which meant that labor had become scarce and valuable. They began to demand higher wages and better treatment. The old patterns of feudal obligation began to break down in some regions as peasants recognized their newfound leverage. In the decades following the plague, this shift in the balance of labor and power between peasants and nobility would manifest in social unrest, in uprisings and rebellions as the old order was challenged by those who had survived the plague and recognized the changing realities of power. The winter also affected how different types of work were disrupted by the plague. Some occupations continued to function, though at reduced capacity. Farmers still had to tend animals, though many would die from neglect or starvation as their owners fell ill. Some craft workers continued their trades, though production was severely reduced, but other occupations became impossible to continue. The soldiers and mercenaries who were sometimes employed by cities and nobles found themselves either sick or dead, or unwilling to remain in plague-stricken areas. Military campaigns were suspended. Fortifications went unmaintained. In some regions, neighboring powers attempted to take advantage of the plague's disruption to seize territory or resources. The defensive capacities of cities and regions were compromised at a moment when external threats might have been particularly dangerous if any neighboring power had been able to mount an effective campaign. That such campaigns were rare during the plague years reflects the universal nature of the catastrophe. Plague struck everywhere, and those who might have been aggressors were just as devastated by it as those who might have been defending against them. The winter also shaped how different regions' economies recovered from the plague's initial impact. In regions where the plague struck early and where winter amplified the devastation, the economic recovery in the following spring and summer was initially slower. There were fewer workers, so production of goods was reduced. Agricultural lands lay fallow because there were not enough people to work them. Merchants who had survived the plague were cautious about resuming trade, uncertain whether the plague would return. But paradoxically, this scarcity of workers and goods eventually created opportunities for economic growth. As production of goods continued to be limited by labor scarcity, prices rose. Workers who survived became more valuable and could demand higher wages. Those who had land could rent it to others and profit from scarcity. In some regions, The survivors of the plague became wealthier than they would have been in a world without plague, even as the absolute number of people had declined dramatically. This enrichment of some survivors created new wealth disparities and new tensions within society. Let us also consider the particular situation of craft guilds during this period. In medieval cities, craft production was organized through guild systems. Guilds controlled the training of apprentices, the quality of goods, and the prices that could be charged. They were designed to protect the interests of established craftsmen and to prevent excessive competition. But the plague threatened the functioning of these systems in multiple ways. Master craftsmen died, sometimes without leaving heirs or apprentices to carry on their trades. In some cases, the knowledge of particular crafts was lost when the last person who knew how to practice it died. In other cases, surviving craftsmen found that there was less demand for their goods because of the reduced population. But in some crafts, there was actually increased demand. Coffin makers and those involved in burial practices found business booming, terrible as that was. Cloth workers who specialized in making clothes for priests found demand continuing, as the church still needed to maintain its rituals. Construction workers found work because there was a need to rebuild structures damaged during the chaos, or to adapt existing structures to new uses as the surviving population repurposed buildings. The winter also affected the particular industries that depended on seasonal supply chains. The wine trade, which was a major element of medieval commerce, was disrupted because the vintage harvest of autumn had to be processed and stored, and this work depended on the availability of workers. Wine presses stood idle as workers died. The leather trade, which depended on the slaughter of animals and the processing of hides, was disrupted because the normal seasonal patterns of animal slaughter were affected by plague deaths among those involved in this work. The wool trade, which was perhaps the most important trade network in medieval Europe, was disrupted because sheep had to be sheared, and the wool had to be collected and processed, all activities that depended on coordinated labor. These disruptions echoed through the economy in ways that are difficult to fully reconstruct, but that clearly had significant consequences for the functioning of the entire commercial system. The financial systems of medieval Europe were also disrupted by the plague. The banking houses of Florence and other Italian cities, which provided credit and financing for major commercial and political enterprises, found themselves facing a crisis as borrowers died and debts went unpaid. Some of the great merchant banking families that had dominated medieval finance faced bankruptcy or severe financial stress. The credit systems that allowed for large-scale enterprises began to fail. The wealthy, whose fortunes had been based on complex webs of credit and debt, found themselves unable to collect what was owed to them. The nobility, who had often borrowed heavily against future revenues, found their income sources disrupted and were unable to repay their debts. These financial disruptions had consequences that extended for decades, creating financial uncertainty that inhibited new investment and enterprise, even as the immediate plague emergency began to subside. The winter also shaped how the plague affected different occupational groups unequally. Physicians, as we have noted, were exposed to plague at high rates and died in significant numbers. But the scarcity of physicians created a kind of paradox. As physicians became rarer, those who survived became more valuable and often became wealthier despite the plague. Priests, similarly, who were devastated by plague mortality, also became more valuable simply because there were so few of them left. In some regions, after the plague had subsided, surviving priests found themselves in positions of much greater authority and respect than they had enjoyed before, and were able to accumulate property and wealth at rates that would have been impossible before the plague. The same was true for skilled workers of all kinds. Labor became so scarce that those who survived often experienced a significant increase in their wages and their standard of living, at least in relative terms. This created a new stratum of wealthy working people, individuals who had been poor before the plague, but who became relatively prosperous after it through the simple fact that their labor was suddenly in high demand and short supply. The winter also affected how long the economic disruptions persisted. In regions where the plague struck in winter, and where winter conditions persisted for months, the economic disruption was compounded and prolonged. By the time spring came and travel and trade could resume, the disruptions had already lasted for months. Merchants' reserves of capital had been depleted. Supply chains had been broken for so long that reestablishing them took months of careful negotiation and rebuilding. In regions where the plague struck in warmer months, or where the plague struck but winter did not follow immediately, the economic disruptions, while severe, sometimes resolved more quickly. The winter thus served as a kind of brake on economic recovery, prolonging the period of disruption and crisis, even as the immediate plague emergency began to subside. The agricultural economy, which was the foundation of all medieval economies, was particularly disrupted by the combination of winter and plague. In many regions, the harvest of 1347 had been completed before the plague arrived in significant numbers. This meant that the stores of grain that were meant to last through the winter were available, though their distribution was disrupted. But the planting and harvest of 1348 were severely affected by plague deaths. Fields that would normally have been prepared and planted in spring remained unplanted because there were not enough workers to do the work. The harvest of 1348 was therefore much smaller than normal in many regions. This meant that the stores laid aside for winter in late 1348 were smaller than they normally would have been, setting up a crisis for the winter of 1348 to 1349. The plague thus created not just an immediate crisis, but a cascading series of crises extending into subsequent years, as each year's reduced harvest set up the conditions for crisis in the following year. It took years for agricultural production to recover to pre-plague levels in many regions, and in some places, recovery took decades. As we settle further into this contemplation of winter and plague, let us turn our attention to the intellectual and cultural responses that emerged from this catastrophe. For the plague was not merely a biological and economic crisis, but a profound intellectual and spiritual challenge that forced people to reconsider their fundamental understandings of the world, of God, of humanity's place in creation. The winter of 1347 to 1348 was a moment when the intellectual frameworks that had governed medieval thought began to crack under the weight of an incomprehensible catastrophe. The scholars and learned people of medieval Europe believed in an ordered universe, governed by divine wisdom and comprehensible through reason and observation. God was good, and the world he had created was fundamentally rational. Disease was understood through the framework of humoral theory, the idea that the body contained four humors that had to be kept in balance. Illness resulted from an imbalance of these humors, which could be corrected through bloodletting, purging, or the application of medicines designed to restore balance. This framework, while incorrect in its fundamental assumptions, provided a way of understanding illness that made sense within the intellectual context of the time. But the plague shattered this comfortable framework. The disease did not behave as it should have according to humoral theory. Bloodletting did not cure it. The application of medicines did not prevent it. The treatments that were supposed to restore the balance of humors seemed, in fact, to accelerate death rather than prevent it. And the plague did not discriminate in the way that disease was supposed to discriminate according to medieval theory. The young and the old both died. The wealthy and the poor both died. Those who lived virtuously seemed to die at similar rates to those who lived dissolute lives. All of this suggested that the existing frameworks for understanding disease were fundamentally inadequate. It was not merely that physicians did not know how to treat the plague. It was that the very basis on which their knowledge rested seemed to be revealed as insufficient or incorrect. This intellectual crisis was intensified by the sheer scale of mortality. Medieval Europe had experienced plagues before, but none with the speed and totality of this one. The deaths were so numerous that they seemed to exceed the capacity of normal disease. Contemporaries struggled to find language and concepts adequate to describe what they were witnessing. Some described it as an apocalyptic event, as a sign of the end times. Some interpreted it as a divine punishment for the sins of humanity. Some saw it as evidence that God had withdrawn his protection from Christian Europe. The plague forced a reckoning with fundamental questions about the nature of God, about divine justice, about the meaning of human suffering. Why would a good God allow such a thing to happen? Why were the innocent struck down alongside the guilty? Why did prayer seem to be ineffective? These were not merely academic questions, but existential ones. Questions that haunted survivors and that demanded answers. The winter also shaped the particular form that these intellectual responses took. The darkness and cold of winter, the sense of being trapped indoors during a plague, the isolation that many people experienced, all of this contributed to a kind of psychological and spiritual turning inward. People had time to contemplate their situation, time to wrestle with difficult questions about meaning and purpose. The winter created a kind of enforced meditation, a confrontation with existential questions that people might have been able to avoid or postpone in times of normal activity and engagement. And out of this winter contemplation emerged various intellectual and spiritual responses. Some people turned to increasingly intense religious devotion, to practices like flagellation, to the idea that through extreme asceticism they might atone for the sins that had brought the plague upon them. Others became more skeptical of religion, wondering if the church's promises of divine protection had any meaning if priests were dying at rates similar to the general population. Still others sought new explanations for the plague, new theories that might make sense of what was happening. One of the most significant intellectual responses to the plague was the increased attention to observation and empirical description. Some physicians and scholars, recognizing that the existing theoretical frameworks were inadequate, began to focus more closely on what they actually observed about the plague. They noted which symptoms appeared in which order. They observed that the plague seemed to spread through contact with the sick and with their possessions. They developed more detailed descriptions of the course of the disease and the appearance of plague victims. This empirical turn, this focus on careful observation rather than on theoretical speculation, represents an important step toward the scientific method that would emerge more fully in later centuries. The plague, through its failure to behave according to existing theories, actually contributed to a shift in how learned people approached the study of nature and disease. The winter, with its enforced indoor time and its separation of scholars from the distractions of normal activity, may have actually contributed to this careful observation and documentation. Scholars had time to record and reflect on what they were observing about the plague. The winter also affected how the plague entered into European art and culture. The visual arts of the post-plague period show a marked shift toward the representation of death and suffering. The dance macabre, a motif in which skeletons and living people are shown dancing together, began to appear more frequently in art and literature after the plague. This motif seems to express a preoccupation with death, a kind of memento mori meditation on the inevitability of death and the equality of all people before death. Nobles and peasants, the young and the old, all dance with the skeleton. This artistic turn toward the representation of death seems to have been influenced by the particular horror of the plague as experienced during winter, the sense of being trapped with death, of the impossibility of escape, of the meaninglessness of social hierarchy in the face of a disease that killed everyone. The winter amplified the psychological impact of the plague, and this amplified impact is reflected in the cultural products that emerged from this period. The literature of the post-plague period also shows a marked preoccupation with death and moral themes. Dante's Inferno, written shortly before the plague, depicts a detailed journey through the afterlife. After the plague, works like the Decameron by Boccaccio, written in the immediate aftermath of the plague's first devastating wave, present stories within stories as a kind of escape from the reality of plague and death. Boccaccio's framing narrative describes a group of young people who flee Florence to escape the plague, and who passed the time telling stories to one another. The very structure of the work, the retreat from the world into a space of storytelling and fantasy, reflects the psychological response to the plague. The winter, with its enforced retreat indoors, with its separation from normal activity, seems to have contributed to a turn toward narrative and storytelling as a way of processing and managing the psychological trauma of the plague. In the cold and dark of winter, stories provided warmth and light, a way of escaping, at least mentally, from the grim reality of the present moment. The plague also had profound effects on religious practice and theology. The failure of prayer and religious practice to prevent the plague or to cure it created a crisis of faith for some people. But for others, it intensified faith and led to new forms of religious devotion. The flagellant movements, in which groups of people would publicly whip themselves as an act of penance, emerged during or shortly after the plague years. These movements seem to represent an attempt to respond to the plague through extreme acts of atonement, as if the perpetrators could somehow atone for the sins that had brought the plague upon humanity. The winter, with its natural association with suffering and hardship, may have contributed to the appeal of these extreme forms of religious practice. The suffering that the winter imposed, combined with the suffering of the plague, created a kind of religious context in which extreme acts of self-mortification seemed meaningful and even necessary. The winter also affected how the plague influenced changes in Christian theology and practice. Some religious thinkers began to develop explanations for the plague that incorporated the observation that it struck the faithful and the unfaithful alike, that prayer did not seem to provide protection. Some argued that the plague was a test of faith, that God was testing the faith of believers, and that those who died were actually being called to eternal reward. Others developed more pessimistic theologies, arguing that God's judgment was inscrutable, that humans could not presume to understand divine intention, that the plague revealed the fundamental sinfulness and vulnerability of humanity. These theological developments, emerging from the intellectual ferment created by the plague, would influence Christian theology for centuries to come. The winter, by creating the conditions under which the plague could strike most devastatingly, thus contributed not just to immediate suffering, but to profound shifts in how European Christianity understood suffering, divine justice, and human nature. The plague also had effects on how people understood medicine and the body. The existing framework of humoral theory had been undermined by the plague's failure to respond to the treatments that humoral theory suggested. But the responses to this crisis of medical knowledge were varied. Some physicians became more careful observers, beginning to develop more accurate descriptions of disease. Others became more desperate, trying ever more extreme treatments in hopes of finding something that might work. Some turned away from medicine entirely, arguing that the plague was purely divine in nature and not susceptible to medical treatment. But across Europe, there seems to have been a gradual accumulation of more careful observation and more detailed description of disease processes. The winter, by creating a context in which physicians had time to observe and reflect on what they were witnessing, may have contributed to this gradual shift toward more careful and empirical approaches to medicine. In the long run, the intellectual crisis created by the plague's failure to respond to existing medical theory would contribute to the eventual development of more effective approaches to understanding and treating disease. The winter also shaped how different regions developed different cultural responses to the plague. In regions where the winter was particularly severe, and where the plague struck particularly hard, the cultural response seems to have involved more extreme forms of religious practice and more dramatic artistic representations of death. In regions where the plague was somewhat less devastating, or where the winter was less severe, the cultural responses seem to have been somewhat more moderate. This suggests that the particular severity of the winter, combined with the severity of the plague, shaped not just how many people died, but also how the survivors psychologically and culturally processed the catastrophe. The winter was not merely a backdrop to the plague, but an active participant in how the plague was understood and responded to. The plague also affected how people understood and related to nature itself. The medieval worldview had generally seen nature as fundamentally ordered and comprehensible, a creation of a rational and benevolent God. But the plague, striking with terrible force during winter when nature itself seemed hostile and threatening, challenged this understanding. Some people began to see nature as more indifferent or even hostile to human interests. The natural world, which was supposed to reflect divine wisdom and benevolence, seemed to be revealing itself as capable of almost incomprehensible cruelty. This shift in how people understood nature would gradually contribute to changes in how Europeans approached the study of nature, and would eventually contribute to the scientific revolution, in which nature came to be understood as governed by laws that could be discovered through careful observation and reason, rather than being seen as a direct expression of divine intention. The winter also affected how the plague influenced changes in social attitudes and hierarchies. The plague struck so indiscriminately, killing so many people regardless of wealth or status, that it challenged the medieval understanding of social order as reflecting divine intention. If God supported the social hierarchy, why did he allow nobles and commoners to die at similar rates? Why did he allow wealthy merchants to perish just as readily as poor workers? These questions, emerging from the observation that the plague did not respect social hierarchy, gradually contributed to changes in how people understood social order and justice. In the decades following the plague, ideas about the natural rights of workers, about the legitimacy of social hierarchy, and about the relationship between wealth and virtue all began to shift. These shifts were not direct consequences of the plague, but were influenced by the plague's challenge to existing assumptions about social order and divine justice. Let us also consider how the plague influenced the development of public health practices. In the immediate aftermath of the plague, cities began to develop more formal systems for managing disease and for attempting to prevent future plagues. Quarantine procedures were developed. Public health officials were appointed. There were attempts to improve sanitation and to limit the movement of people in times of disease outbreak. These public health practices, while not always effective during the plague years because they were based on incomplete understanding of how the disease spread, would gradually develop into more effective systems. The winter, by creating the conditions under which the plague could spread so rapidly and so extensively, contributed to the urgency with which cities approached the development of public health systems. The trauma of the plague was so severe that it motivated the development of new institutions and practices designed to prevent future plagues. The winter also shaped how the plague influenced the development of record-keeping and statistics. In order to understand and respond to the plague, cities began to keep more detailed records of deaths, of illnesses, of the movement of people. These records, crude as they were by modern standards, represent an early form of epidemiological tracking. The winter, by creating a crisis that demanded response and understanding, seems to have motivated the development of more careful record-keeping and more systematic approaches to understanding disease patterns. These record-keeping practices, developed in response to the plague, would eventually contribute to the development of modern epidemiology and public health science. As we journey deeper into the contemplation of this historical moment, let us turn our focus to the particular ways in which the plague altered the demographic landscape of Europe, and how the winter shaped this demographic catastrophe. The plague arrived at a moment when European populations had been growing for several centuries. The improvements in agricultural technology that had occurred during the High Middle Ages had led to increased food production, which had sustained a growing population. Cities had expanded, new settlements had been founded. The population of Europe in 1347 was probably around 75 million people, though exact figures are difficult to determine. The plague, striking with terrible force during the winter months when populations were most vulnerable, began to reverse this centuries-long trend of population growth. The mortality rates during the plague years were so severe that in some regions, the population was cut in half or more. In some cities, the mortality was even more catastrophic, with some urban centers losing 60, 70, or even 80% of their population in the course of a year or two. The winter amplified these mortality rates in ways that are difficult to fully quantify, but that are evident from the historical record. In regions where winter was particularly severe, where cold temperatures and snow persisted for months, the combination of plague mortality and winter deaths from cold and starvation was most intense. In milder climates, the mortality was somewhat lower, though still catastrophic. The effect of this differential mortality was to transform the demographic map of Europe. Some regions were more severely affected than others. Italy, particularly the port cities, suffered some of the earliest and most severe mortality. Southern France, with its connection to Mediterranean trade routes, was heavily affected. England, somewhat removed from the primary trade routes, experienced somewhat lower mortality in the initial years, though the plague eventually reached there as well. Spain and Portugal, on the periphery of European trade networks, experienced somewhat lower initial mortality, though again the plague eventually reached everywhere. The winter also shaped how the plague affected different age groups and different segments of the population differently. In normal times, elderly people have higher mortality rates than younger people. But during the plague, children and young people seem to have suffered disproportionately. This may have been because young people's immune systems had not developed the resistances that older people had acquired through previous exposures to disease. It may also have been because the behavior patterns of younger people, their greater activity and movement, led to higher exposure to the plague. The loss of so many young people had profound demographic consequences. It meant that the population could not recover as quickly as it might have if people of reproductive age had survived at higher rates. It meant that the transmission of knowledge and skills from one generation to the next was disrupted. In some communities, entire age cohorts were essentially wiped out, leaving strange gaps in the population structure that would affect communities for decades. The winter also affected how plague mortality was distributed geographically within regions. Urban areas, with their higher population densities and their closer contact between people, suffered more severely than rural areas. The plague spread most rapidly in cities, where the conditions of winter crowding were most intense. Rural areas, more dispersed and with less dense population, often experienced lower mortality rates, though still catastrophic ones. This urban-rural differential in mortality had consequences for the structure of European society and economy. In the pre-plague period, there had been a gradual trend toward urbanization, with more people moving to cities seeking economic opportunity. The plague reversed this trend in many regions. The surviving rural population sometimes moved into depopulated urban areas, but more often there was a movement away from devastated cities toward rural areas and smaller settlements. This shift in settlement patterns had long-term consequences for how European society reorganized itself in the post-plague period. The winter also shaped how the plague affected different occupational groups with different severities. As we have noted, clergy died at high rates because of their ministry to the sick. But other occupational groups were affected differently. Physicians and surgeons died at high rates. Those involved in burial and mortuary work died at high rates. Midwives and nurses, roles often filled by women, died at high rates because of their involvement in caring for the sick. Other occupational groups, such as farmers and craftspeople who worked more in isolation, had somewhat lower exposure to the plague. This differential mortality by occupation meant that different skills and knowledge were lost at different rates. The knowledge of particular medical practices, particular craft techniques, particular forms of expertise was lost when the practitioners of these skills died, and there were no survivors to pass the knowledge on to the next generation. In some cases, this loss of knowledge had long-term consequences, with certain practices and techniques being lost to European civilization for extended periods until they were eventually rediscovered or relearned. The winter also affected how the plague influenced gender ratios within surviving populations. There is some evidence that women survived the plague at somewhat higher rates than men in certain regions, though the reasons for this are unclear. It may have been that women, being more confined to indoor spaces during normal times, had somewhat less exposure to the plague in some circumstances. It may have been that women's social roles as primary caregivers led to complex patterns of exposure and recovery. Or the differential mortality by gender may have been due to factors that we cannot now determine from the historical record. What is clear is that in some post-plague communities, there were more surviving women than men, which had consequences for family formation, marriage patterns, and social organization in the years following the plague. Let us consider now the matter of depopulation and abandoned land. In many regions, after the plague's initial onslaught, there was an abundance of unused land. Entire villages had been depopulated, with all the inhabitants dead and no survivors to claim the land or to continue agricultural production. This land lay fallow and gradually returned to forest or rough grazing. In the pre-plague period, land had been a scarce commodity, jealously guarded and carefully controlled. In the post-plague period, land became abundant and labor became scarce. This reversal of scarcity had profound consequences for the social and economic organization of Europe. Those who survived the plague often found themselves in a position to acquire land at low cost. Some of the poor, who had never had any hope of owning land in the pre-plague period, found themselves able to acquire abandoned holdings. Some of the newly wealthy craftspeople and merchants were able to acquire land. This redistribution of property had consequences for social mobility and for the rigidity of social hierarchies. The winter also affected how quickly depopulated areas were repopulated and resettled. In regions where the winter was particularly severe, where the climate made survival difficult even without the plague, repopulation was slower. In milder regions, resettlement sometimes began relatively quickly as survivors moved into depopulated areas seeking land and opportunity. In some regions, however, the trauma of the plague was so severe that people were reluctant to return to areas that had been particularly hard hit. There was a kind of cultural memory of plague that persisted for decades or even centuries in some communities, influencing where people chose to live and work. The winter, by intensifying the psychological trauma of the plague, may have contributed to this reluctance to return to plague-stricken areas, slowing repopulation and prolonging the period during which large areas were sparsely populated. The plague also affected the long-term demographic trajectory of Europe in ways that took generations to fully unfold. In the immediate aftermath of the plague, there was a period of decades during which the surviving population was relatively stable or continued to decline as the plague persisted and occasional new outbreaks occurred. But eventually, as people adapted to the post-plague environment, and as the plague became less frequent and less severe, the population began to grow again. However, the growth was slower and more uncertain than it had been in the pre-plague period. For more than a century after the initial plague outbreak, the European population remained well below pre-plague levels. It was not until well into the 15th century that the European population began to approach pre-plague levels in many regions. This prolonged depression of population had consequences for the development of European society and economy that extended for centuries. The slow recovery of population meant that labor remained relatively scarce for a long period, which meant that workers retained relatively high bargaining power. This contributed to the gradual increase in wages for common workers that occurred during the late medieval period, and that had social and political consequences that extended into the early modern period. The winter also shaped how the plague influenced long-term patterns of migration and settlement. In the pre-plague period, there had been gradual trends of population movement and the founding of new settlements. The plague disrupted these patterns and created new possibilities for migration and resettlement. In some regions, the plague-induced depopulation created a kind of vacuum that was filled by migrants from regions that had been less severely affected. Some historians suggest that the plague contributed to the development of a more mobile population, with people more willing to move from place to place in search of opportunity. The winter, by concentrating mortality in particular locations and creating a kind of demographic patchwork of severe and less severe plague impact, may have contributed to this post-plague mobility. The survivors of regions that had been most severely affected by the plague may have been more willing to move away from their home communities, seeking to escape the trauma and the depopulation. Let us also consider how the plague affected family structures and inheritance patterns in ways that had demographic consequences. In the pre-plague period, inheritance patterns were generally from father to son, with property passing through the male line. The plague disrupted these patterns by killing so many people that entire family lines ended. In some cases, property passed to daughters who had survived or to more distant relatives. In some cases, property reverted to the state or to the church. These disruptions to inheritance patterns had consequences for how property was distributed and how wealth was accumulated in post-plague society. The traditional patrilineal inheritance patterns were disrupted for a generation or more in many regions, as the plague forced people to adapt to new situations where the normal inheritance paths were not available. The plague also affected how mortality was distributed across seasons in the years following the initial outbreak. In 1347 to 1348, the plague was concentrated in winter. But in subsequent years, the plague persisted year-round, with no particular seasonal pattern. This suggests that the plague became established in Europe in a way that allowed it to spread throughout the year, not just in winter. However, in some regions and in some years, seasonal patterns of plague mortality did emerge, with higher mortality in certain seasons than in others. These variable seasonal patterns had demographic consequences, affecting when people were most likely to die, and thus affecting the age structure and gender ratios of surviving populations. The winter also affected how the plague influenced the development of new settlements and the abandonment of existing ones. In the post-plague period, some of the old settlements that had been severely depopulated were not resettled. Instead, new settlements were founded in different locations, often in places that had better access to resources or that were considered safer from plague. This gradual shift in settlement patterns had long-term consequences for the geography of Europe. Some regions that had been centers of population before the plague never fully recovered their pre-plague importance. Other regions rose in importance as populations shifted. The winter, by making certain areas particularly vulnerable to the combined effects of cold and plague, may have contributed to long-term shifts in which areas were attractive for settlement. The plague also affected how people understood population itself and began to think about demography in new ways. The scale of the plague-induced mortality forced people to confront questions about the size of populations, about the carrying capacity of the land, about the relationship between population and resources. Some medieval thinkers began to consider whether the plague represented a kind of natural limit on population growth, or whether God had sent the plague to prevent overpopulation. These early demographic theories, though crude by modern standards, represent an important step toward the development of more sophisticated understandings of population dynamics. The winter, with its annual cycle of scarcity and the constant concern about whether stored food would be sufficient, may have contributed to these early demographic reflections. The plague and the winter together created a context in which questions about population, survival, and resources became urgent and unavoidable. The winter also affected how the plague influenced the long-term genetic makeup of European populations. The plague created what population geneticists call a bottleneck, a moment when a population is drastically reduced and when random genetic drift can have significant effects. The survivors of the plague were not a representative sample of the pre-plague population. They were those who happened to be in locations where transmission was lower, or who happened to have genetic resistances to the plague, or who were simply lucky. This means that the post-plague European population had a different genetic composition than the pre-plague population. Over generations, as the surviving population grew, the genetic characteristics of the survivors became increasingly dominant in the European gene pool. The effects of this genetic bottleneck persisted for many generations, though they gradually diminished as the post-plague population grew, and as gene flow from non-plague-affected regions reintroduced genetic diversity. Let us also consider how the plague affected patterns of child mortality and birth rates in ways that had demographic consequences. The plague killed many children, reducing the number of young people who survived to reproductive age. Additionally, the trauma of the plague, the social disruption, and the economic hardship seem to have reduced birth rates in the years immediately following the plague. The combination of reduced births and high child mortality meant that the population took a very long time to recover. In some regions, the population did not begin to grow again until 50 or 100 years after the initial plague outbreak. This extended period of population stagnation or decline had consequences for the entire structure of European society and economy that extended for centuries. The winter also affected how the plague influenced migration patterns to and from Europe. In the pre-plague period, there had been relatively limited migration between Europe and other parts of the world, though there was some contact through trade and through the Crusades. The plague, by creating a period of severe social disruption and reduced economic activity in Europe, may have reduced outward migration from Europe. At the same time, it may have made Europe somewhat less attractive as a destination for migrants from elsewhere, though the evidence for this is limited. The plague created a kind of demographic isolation for Europe, a period during which European populations were focused on internal recovery rather than on expansion outward or interaction with other regions. As we settle even deeper into this historical meditation, let us now turn our contemplation toward the social upheavals and transformations that emerged in the plague's aftermath. For the winter of 1347 to 1348 was not merely a moment of death and suffering, but a hinge point upon which the entire structure of medieval society would begin to turn. The survivors of the plague found themselves in a world that had been fundamentally altered, and the changes they experienced would ripple through the centuries that followed. In the immediate aftermath of the plague's first devastating wave, as spring arrived and the worst of the dying seemed to have subsided, the survivors emerged from their homes to find a landscape transformed almost beyond recognition. In cities, entire quarters lay empty. The smell of death that had permeated the air during winter gradually faded as the weather warmed, but the emptiness remained, a constant reminder of what had been lost. Fields that should have been planted with grain lay fallow because there were not enough people to work them. The roads, normally dangerous enough during winter, were now even more hazardous because they were less frequently traveled and less well maintained. The social structures that had held medieval society together for centuries had been severely strained by the plague, and were now beginning to crack and shift. One of the most immediate social consequences of the plague was the disruption of the feudal system and the traditional patterns of obligation and dependency that had characterized medieval Europe. In the pre-plague period, the feudal system had created a relatively stable, if hierarchical, structure in which peasants were bound to particular lords and lands, and in which the lord had obligations to protect his peasants and to ensure their subsistence. The plague disrupted this system by killing so many peasants that the survivors suddenly found themselves in a position of relative power. Labor had become scarce, and those who had survived the plague knew that their labor was valuable. In many regions, surviving peasants began to demand higher wages and better treatment. They began to refuse to perform the customary services that had been required of them. Some abandoned their traditional holdings and sought work in other regions where wages were higher. The winter, by concentrating mortality in particular locations, meant that some regions were more severely depopulated than others. Peasants from regions that had been less severely affected could migrate to regions that had been more severely affected, seeking the higher wages that scarce labor commanded. This disruption to the traditional feudal labor system had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate post-plague years. In some regions, the old patterns of feudal obligation were never fully restored. Peasants, having experienced a period of relative power and higher wages, were reluctant to return to the old patterns of obligation and service. The nobility, desperate for workers to tend their lands and to produce the goods they depended on, were forced to negotiate with peasants in ways that they had never done before. This led to gradual changes in the conditions of peasant life, with some regions seeing the gradual development of wage labor in place of feudal obligation, and with other regions seeing the emergence of a peasant class with somewhat greater security and better defined rights than had existed before the plague. These changes did not happen uniformly or immediately, but over the course of decades and generations, the plague contributed to the gradual erosion of the feudal system as it had existed in the pre-plague period. The winter also affected how the disruption to feudal relationships played out in different regions. In regions where the winter was particularly severe and where the plague had struck particularly hard, the nobility were most desperate for workers and were therefore most willing to concede to peasant demands. In regions where the winter was milder and where the plague impact was somewhat less severe, the nobility retained more power and were able to resist peasant demands more effectively. This created a geographic patchwork of post-plague social conditions, with some regions seeing more significant shifts in the balance of power between peasants and nobility, while other regions saw more continuity with pre-plague patterns. Over time, these regional variations would gradually converge as people migrated from regions with lower wages to regions with higher wages, creating pressure for wages and conditions to become more uniform across Europe. The plague also triggered a series of social upheavals and rebellions that emerged in the decades following the initial outbreak. In some regions, the increased power of surviving workers and the resentments that had accumulated during the plague years led to uprisings against the nobility. The peasants' revolt in England in 1381, occurring about 33 years after the initial plague outbreak, was one of the most significant of these rebellions. The revolt was triggered by an attempt by the nobility to impose new taxes and to restore feudal obligations, but it drew on the accumulated resentments and the transformed social consciousness that had emerged from the plague years. The peasants who participated in the revolt were emboldened by their knowledge of their own value in a labor-scarce economy, and by their memories of the relative power they had possessed in the years immediately following the plague. The winter, which had stripped away the illusions of feudal stability and had revealed the vulnerability of the entire social order, had left psychological scars that manifested in these post-plague rebellions. Let us consider now how the plague affected urban society and the status of urban workers. In the pre-plague period, cities were dominated by merchant elites and by guild-organized craft workers. The plague disrupted both of these groups, though in different ways. Many wealthy merchants died, and the remaining merchants found their access to trade routes disrupted and their capital depleted. This created an opportunity for social mobility, with surviving merchants sometimes becoming wealthier through their control of scarce goods, but with new merchants also able to rise to prominence in the disrupted post-plague economy. The guild system, which had been designed to control production and to limit competition, was disrupted by plague mortality. Many guild masters died without leaving heirs or apprentices to continue their crafts. In some cases, the knowledge of particular crafts was lost. In other cases, surviving guild members found themselves in positions of increased power because their skills were scarce. The winter, which had driven people together into crowded urban spaces, had created the conditions for the plague to spread rapidly through urban populations. But it had also created the conditions for the emergence of a more mobile urban working class, people who could move between cities seeking higher wages and better opportunities. The plague also affected gender relations and the position of women in medieval society in ways that had long-term social consequences. With so many men dead from the plague, women found themselves in new positions, sometimes taking over the work that men had done, sometimes inheriting property and businesses that would have passed to male heirs had they survived. In some cases, women found increased opportunities for economic activity and independence. However, these opportunities were often contested by men who sought to reclaim their pre-plague positions. In some regions, there were attempts to legally restrict women's economic activities or to exclude them from particular occupations. These conflicts between women seeking to retain the economic opportunities they had gained and men seeking to restore pre-plague gender hierarchies played out over decades in different ways in different regions. The winter, which had forced everyone indoors and had challenged all established patterns of social organization, had also challenged the established patterns of gender relations, and the plague's aftermath saw ongoing struggles to renegotiate those relations. The plague also affected the structure of families and kinship networks in ways that had long-term social consequences. In the pre-plague period, extended families often lived in proximity to one another, with complex patterns of mutual obligation and support. The plague shattered many of these extended family networks, killing so many family members that the survivors often had no close relatives left. In some cases, orphaned children were taken in by more distant relatives or by community members. In other cases, orphans were left to fend for themselves. The loss of the extended family network as a source of support and identity seems to have contributed to the development of more nuclear family structures in the post-plague period. The bonds between parents and children, between spouses, became more central, while the broader extended family network became less important. These changes in family structure had consequences that extended into subsequent centuries, affecting how people understood kinship, inheritance, and social obligation. Let us also consider how the plague affected the role of the church and religious institutions in medieval society. The church, which had been the dominant institution in medieval Europe, found its authority and prestige somewhat diminished by its inability to prevent or cure the plague. The clergy died at high rates, and the church's response to the plague seemed inadequate to the scale of the catastrophe. In some regions, this led to a decline in religious faith or to criticism of the church. In other regions, people turned to even more intense religious devotion, seeking spiritual explanations and spiritual remedies for the plague. The winter, with its natural association with death and suffering, created a context in which religious meditation on suffering and redemption became particularly intense. The church, recognizing the spiritual crisis that the plague had created, began to adapt its theology and practice to address the new realities of post-plague society. New devotional practices emerged. New saints were venerated. The theology of suffering and redemption was reimagined in light of the plague experience. The plague also affected political structures and the power of secular rulers. In the pre-plague period, kings and nobles were powerful, but their power was constrained by complex feudal obligations and by the power of local lords. The plague disrupted these power structures in ways that sometimes strengthened central authority and sometimes weakened it. In some regions, rulers attempted to use the plague as an opportunity to centralize power and to reduce the power of local lords. In other regions, the plague weakened central authority and strengthened local powers. These shifts in political power had long-term consequences for the development of different European states. The winter, which had created a crisis that demanded response and organization, seems to have motivated rulers to develop more centralized systems of administration and to attempt to impose more uniform rules and laws across their territories. The attempts to control the plague through quarantine measures and through restrictions on movement led to the development of more sophisticated systems of governance and administration. The plague also affected how people understood law and justice in medieval society. The plague created situations where normal legal structures were inadequate or could not function. In some cases, property disputes arose when heirs could not be found, or when the normal rules of inheritance could not be applied because the expected heirs had died. In other cases, crimes went unpunished because the legal systems were overwhelmed. The survivors, witnessing the inadequacy of existing legal structures in the face of the plague's disruptions, began to demand new laws and more effective legal systems. Some regions developed new legal codes that attempted to address the specific problems created by the plague. Other regions attempted to strengthen their existing legal systems to make them more effective in managing the chaos. The winter, which had created the conditions for the plague to strike with such force, had also created the conditions for legal and governmental systems to be reimagined and reformed. Let us consider now how the plague affected class structure and social stratification in medieval society. In the pre-plague period, society was organized into relatively rigid classes. The nobility, the clergy, the merchants and wealthy townspeople, the craftspeople, the peasants, and the poor. The plague disrupted these class structures in ways that varied by region and by the particular circumstances of the plague's spread. In some regions, New wealth was created through the control of scarce goods, allowing some people to move up in social status. In other regions, accumulated wealth was destroyed by the plague, and formerly wealthy families fell into poverty. The winter, which had created extreme conditions of hardship and crisis, had demonstrated that social status provided little protection against death and suffering. This realization seems to have contributed to a gradual shift in how people understood social hierarchy. The belief that social position reflected divine will, that the poor deserved their poverty and the rich deserved their wealth, was shaken by the plague's indiscriminate mortality. The winter amplified this challenge to traditional beliefs about social hierarchy, creating a psychological context in which people were more willing to question the foundations of the existing social order. The plague also affected how people understood and practiced charity and mutual aid. In the pre-plague period, charity was organized primarily through the church, with religious institutions providing support to the poor and the sick. The plague overwhelmed these systems, creating a scale of need that existing charitable structures could not address. Faced with the inadequacy of traditional charity, communities began to develop new systems of mutual aid and community support. In some cases, guilds took on greater responsibility for supporting their members and their families. In other cases, secular authorities began to organize poor relief and public welfare systems. The winter, which had created hunger and cold in addition to plague, created urgent needs for food and shelter that motivated the development of more organized community responses. These early forms of organized welfare and poor relief, emerging from the necessity of the plague years, represent early steps toward the development of more formal systems of social welfare that would emerge in subsequent centuries. The plague also affected urban-rural relations and the balance of power between cities and the countryside. In the pre-plague period, cities had been growing in power and influence relative to the countryside. The plague reversed this trend in some regions. The depopulation of cities was often more severe than the depopulation of rural areas, which meant that rural areas, which had been losing population to cities before the plague, now saw surviving rural populations increase in relative importance. In some regions, this led to a shift in power away from cities and back toward the countryside and toward rural lords. In other regions, cities maintained or eventually regained their dominance. The winter, which had created conditions favoring the spread of the plague in dense urban populations, had thus contributed to a temporary shift in the balance of power away from cities and back toward the countryside. Over time, as cities recovered and as urban populations grew again, the long-term trend of urbanization resumed. But the plague had demonstrated the vulnerability of dense urban populations and had created a period during which the countryside was relatively more important and more powerful than it had been before the plague. The plague also affected how people understood craft knowledge and the transmission of skills from one generation to the next. In the pre-plague period, craft knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeship systems organized by guilds. The plague disrupted these systems by killing many master craftspeople before they had trained apprentices to carry on their knowledge. In some cases, entire crafts or particular techniques were lost to European civilization for generations, until they were eventually rediscovered or relearned from sources in the Islamic world or elsewhere. The winter, which had created conditions of extreme stress and which had disrupted normal social functioning, seems to have accelerated the loss of knowledge and skills. The need to focus on immediate survival left less time and resources for the careful transmission of craft knowledge. In the post-plague period, as surviving craftspeople sought to rebuild their trades, they faced the challenge of retraining new apprentices with knowledge that had been partially lost. This loss and recovery of craft knowledge is evident in the historical record through changes in the style and quality of goods produced in different regions before and after the plague. As we continue our deep meditation on this historical moment, let us turn our attention now to the religious and spiritual transformations that emerged from the plague experience. For the winter of 1347 to 1348 represented not merely a physical catastrophe, but a profound spiritual crisis that would reshape European Christianity and would influence how people understood their relationship to God, to suffering, and to redemption. The medieval church had developed a complex theology that attempted to explain suffering and hardship as part of God's providential plan. Suffering was understood as an opportunity for spiritual growth, as a test of faith, as a punishment for sin. The poor and the sick were sometimes seen as specially favored by God because their suffering gave them opportunities for spiritual merit. But the plague shattered these comfortable theological frameworks. The scale of the plague was so immense, the suffering so indiscriminate, that existing theological explanations seemed inadequate. How could one explain the deaths of innocent children as a test of faith or as punishment for sin? How could one explain the deaths of saints and holy people at rates comparable to sinners and the wicked? How could one explain the death of pregnant women, of priests administering last rites, of those who were devoted to prayer and penance? The existing theological frameworks simply could not account for the plague's devastation. The winter amplified this theological crisis by creating a psychological context in which questions about suffering and divine justice became urgent and unavoidable. The long nights and the darkness of winter created a natural context for contemplation and introspection. People had time to meditate on the meaning of the plague, to wrestle with difficult theological questions. The cold itself was a constant reminder of suffering and of human vulnerability. The scarcity of food and fuel created a context in which people experienced genuine hardship even before the plague struck. And then the plague came, adding a layer of suffering that seemed to exceed anything that natural winter hardship could inflict. This combination of winter suffering and plague suffering created a psychological state in which people were forced to confront fundamental questions about meaning, purpose, and divine justice. Some religious thinkers responded to this crisis by developing new theological frameworks that attempted to accommodate the reality of the plague into existing Christian theology. Some argued that the plague was a sign of the end times, that Christ's return was imminent, and that the plague was one of the signs that would precede the resurrection of the dead and the final judgment. This apocalyptic interpretation of the plague created a sense of urgency and of cosmic significance. If the end times were near, then the concerns of everyday life, acquiring property, establishing oneself in a career, raising children, became less important than spiritual preparation for the end times. This apocalyptic interpretation seems to have been particularly prevalent in the winter and early spring of the plague, when the mortality was most intense and when people could most easily believe that the world was coming to an end. Other religious thinkers developed interpretations of the plague as a divine punishment for the sins of humanity. They argued that the plague was God's judgment on a sinful world, and that repentance and penance were necessary to appease God's wrath. This interpretation led to the development of intense religious movements focused on penance and atonement. The flagellant movements, in which groups of people would publicly whip themselves as an act of penance, emerged during the plague years and gained particular intensity in the winter months. These movements seem to have represented an attempt to atone for the sins that had brought the plague upon humanity, to offer suffering and pain as a kind of substitute for the suffering of the plague itself. The winter, with its natural association with suffering and deprivation, created a psychological context in which extreme acts of self-mortification seemed meaningful and spiritually necessary. The flagellants would process through cities during the winter months, whipping themselves publicly in the snow and cold, creating a kind of performance of suffering that was meant to move God to mercy. Yet another theological response to the plague was developed by thinkers who argued that God's purposes were ultimately inscrutable, that humans could not presume to understand divine intention, and that the plague revealed the profound limitations of human knowledge and understanding. This more pessimistic theological interpretation led to a kind of spiritual humility, to an acceptance of suffering as something that could not be explained, but only endured. This interpretation was somewhat more psychologically sustainable than the others, in that it did not require people to believe that they could understand or atone for the plague, but simply to accept it as part of the mysterious workings of divine providence. The winter, with its long periods of darkness and cold, seems to have created a psychological context in which this more accepting, more humble theological stance had particular appeal. In the darkness of winter, with little hope of immediate change or improvement, acceptance of suffering as an inscrutable part of divine providence may have seemed more realistic than attempts to understand or atone for it. The plague also triggered significant challenges to the authority of the Church and to the credibility of religious institutions. The clergy died at high rates, and in some regions, so many priests died that there were not enough survivors to maintain the sacramental functions of the Church. Masses could not be said because there were no priests to say them. Confessions could not be heard because there were no priests available to hear them. The sacraments, which were understood as essential to Christian salvation, simply could not be administered in many places. This practical failure of the Church to fulfill its central religious functions had profound consequences for people's faith and for their understanding of the Church's authority and power. If the Church could not provide access to the sacraments, if priests died just as readily as anyone else and could not protect their congregations from plague, what was the meaning of the Church's claims to spiritual authority? Some people began to turn away from the Church, to develop more personal or heretical forms of religious belief that did not depend on the mediation of priests or the structure of the institutional church. The winter also affected how the plague influenced the development of mysticism and personal religious experience. With the institutional church failing to provide spiritual comfort and guidance, some people turned toward more personal forms of religious experience, toward direct communication with God unmediated by priests or institutions. The long winters, with their isolation and darkness, created a psychological context in which private religious meditation and mystical experience had particular appeal. People spent long hours alone in their homes during the winter, and some of these hours were spent in prayer and religious contemplation. Some of the most significant mystical and contemplative religious movements of the late medieval period seem to have emerged from, or been intensified by the plague experience and the winter meditations it created. The German Rhineland mysticism, for example, seems to have developed in connection with the trauma of the plague and the questioning of institutional religious authority that the plague had triggered. The plague also affected how people understood sin and guilt in relation to the plague. In the pre-plague period, sin was understood as an individual act or characteristic that brought divine punishment. But the plague challenged this understanding because it seemed to punish people indiscriminately, regardless of their individual moral status. Some people began to develop theologies of collective sin, arguing that the entire human community shared responsibility for the plague, that it was a collective punishment for collective sin. This shift from understanding sin as individual to understanding it as collective had consequences for how people understood moral responsibility and social obligation. If everyone was collectively guilty for the plague, then everyone shared collective responsibility for atonement and redemption. This collective understanding of sin and guilt seems to have contributed to the willingness of communities to undertake collective acts of penance, such as the flagellant processions, or to support collective welfare and relief systems. Let us also consider how the plague affected the development of saint veneration and the cult of the saints in medieval Christianity. The plague had killed many people, and in some cases, people who were killed by the plague came to be understood as saints or martyrs. Saint Sebastian, who had been venerated in pre-plague Christianity as a saint who had survived torture and execution, became particularly associated with plague victims and became a focus of devotion for those seeking protection from or recovery from plague. New saints emerged from the plague years, people who had died from plague or who had ministered to plague victims. The winter, with its association with death and suffering, created a psychological context in which saint veneration and the cult of the saints became more intense and more focused on themes of suffering, death, and redemption. The saints became understood not merely as distant spiritual exemplars, but as more immediate intercessors who could understand and address the suffering caused by the plague. The plague also affected how people understood the afterlife and the possibility of salvation. The rapidity with which people died from the plague meant that many people did not have time to make confession, to receive extreme function, to undertake the normal preparations for death that medieval Christianity emphasized. This created anxiety about whether people who died from plague had adequate time to prepare spiritually for death and judgment. Some religious thinkers began to develop theologies that suggested that God would judge plague victims with mercy, that the scale of the plague might supersede the normal requirements for spiritual preparation. Other thinkers maintained more rigorous positions, suggesting that those who died without proper preparation would face damnation regardless of the circumstances of their death. These theological debates about the fate of plague victims had significant emotional and spiritual consequences for survivors, who were sometimes tormented by worry about whether their deceased loved ones had achieved salvation or had been damned. The winter also affected how the plague influenced the development of religious art and iconography. The dance macabre, the motif in which death in the form of a skeleton dances with living people of various social stations, became increasingly prominent in art and literature in the post-plague period. This motif seems to express a preoccupation with death and with the equality of all people before death, regardless of social status or spiritual merit. The visual representation of death as a skeleton dancing with nobles and peasants alike seems to reflect the plague's demonstration that death came indiscriminately, that social hierarchy provided no protection, that all people faced the same mortality. The winter, with its natural association with death and decay, seems to have contributed to the psychological context in which these visual representations of death became prominent and meaningful. In the darkness of winter, surrounded by cold and by images of decay and dormancy in nature, the dance macabre had particular psychological resonance. The plague also affected how people understood repentance and penance in medieval Christianity. In the pre-plague period, penance was understood as a kind of spiritual discipline, a way of atoning for sin and of demonstrating contrition. But the plague intensified the emotional and spiritual significance of penance and created conditions under which more extreme forms of penance seemed necessary and meaningful. The flagellant movements, with their public whipping and self-inflicted suffering, represented an attempt to engage in extreme forms of penance that would be adequate to the scale of the plague's devastation. The winter, with its natural suffering and deprivation, created a context in which extreme acts of self-mortification had particular psychological and spiritual resonance. In the cold and darkness of winter, the pain inflicted through flagellation might seem like a meaningful response to the incomprehensible suffering of the plague. Let us consider now how the plague affected the relationship between Christianity and Judaism in medieval Europe. In some regions, The plague was blamed on Jews, who were accused of poisoning wells or of engaging in other malevolent activities that had supposedly caused the plague. These accusations, though entirely baseless from a scientific perspective, were taken seriously by some medieval Christians and led to pogroms and massacres of Jewish communities in several regions. The winter, with its natural tendency to concentrate populations in closer quarters and to create conditions of fear and anxiety, seems to have contributed to the development and spread of these accusations. In the close quarters of winter, in the atmosphere of fear and desperation, scapegoating seems to have been particularly intense. The Jewish communities of medieval Europe, who were already subject to discrimination and restrictions, became targets for blame when the plague could not be understood or controlled through normal means. The winter plague thus contributed to one of the darkest chapters in medieval Christian-Jewish relations, a chapter that would have echoes extending into subsequent centuries. The plague also affected how people understood the role of medicine and medical knowledge within a Christian framework. In the pre-plague period, medical knowledge was sometimes viewed with suspicion by religious authorities, who saw it as potentially conflicting with divine authority and spiritual healing. But the plague, by demonstrating that prayer and penance alone could not cure disease, seems to have created a context in which medical knowledge became more valued and more integrated into Christian understanding. Some religious thinkers began to argue that medical knowledge was a gift from God, that physicians were engaged in a kind of spiritual work when they attempted to heal the sick. The winter, with its natural dangers from cold and starvation in addition to plague, seems to have created conditions under which practical knowledge about survival and healing became more valued and more integrated into overall worldviews. The integration of medical knowledge into a Christian framework would continue to develop in subsequent centuries, contributing to the eventual emergence of Christian hospitals and the professionalization of medical practice. The plague also affected how Christian theological thinking about suffering developed in subsequent centuries. The medieval theology of redemptive suffering, the idea that suffering could have spiritual meaning and value when understood in relation to Christ's passion and redemption, was intensified and complicated by the plague experience. Theologians had to grapple with the question of whether the suffering of plague victims could be understood as redemptive, as having spiritual meaning. Some argued yes, that plague victims who suffered and died could unite their suffering with Christ's passion and thus achieve spiritual merit. Others argued that such suffering had no necessary spiritual meaning, that God's purposes were inscrutable, and that plague victims could only endure their suffering and trust in divine mercy. These theological debates about the meaning of plague suffering would continue for centuries and would influence how Christians understood suffering in general. As we approach the end of our long night's contemplation, let us bring together the threads of this story and find a place of rest and understanding. The winter of 1347 to 1348 stands in history as a moment when the natural world, through the mechanism of cold and season, became intertwined with one of humanity's greatest catastrophes. We have traced how the plague arrived in Europe not in spring or summer, but in the season of darkness and cold, and how this timing shaped everything that followed. We have seen how the biology of the plague itself was altered by winter conditions, how fleas thrived in the warm spaces where people huddled together, how the pneumonic form of the plague spread with devastating efficiency through crowded indoor spaces. We have considered the economic disruptions, the social upheavals, the psychological traumas that emerged from this collision of season and disease. We have witnessed how the winter amplified the plague's effects at every level: biological, social, economic, cultural, and spiritual. But as we prepare to close our eyes and drift towards sleep, let us find meaning in this dark historical chapter. The plague was terrible, yes, but it was also a catalyst for change. The survivors of the plague found themselves in a world transformed. Labor had become valuable. Social hierarchies had been challenged. Old certainties had been shattered. The winter that had amplified the plague's devastation had also created the conditions for this questioning and transformation. In the darkness and cold, as people contemplated suffering and mortality, as they saw the inadequacy of existing frameworks for understanding their experience, they began to imagine different possibilities, different ways of organizing society, different understandings of knowledge and of humanity's place in the world. The survivors emerged from the plague changed, scarred, but also transformed. They had endured something that seemed to exceed human capacity to endure. They had faced the reality of death on a scale that was almost incomprehensible, and yet they had survived. This survival, this simple fact of continuing to exist after such devastation, represented a kind of triumph. The will to live had proven stronger than the plague's killing power. The determination to rebuild, to continue, to create meaning from suffering, had manifested in countless small acts of survival and reconstruction that, when taken together, represented humanity's fundamental refusal to surrender to despair. The winter of 1347 to 1348 thus stands as a threshold moment in European history, a moment when one world ended and another began to emerge. The plague would return in subsequent years and would continue to shape European history for centuries. The winter would return each year, bringing with it the cold and darkness that had characterized it for millennia. But the combination of winter and plague in that first terrible year had created something unique, something that would echo through the centuries. It had demonstrated the fragility of human civilization and the power of natural forces to transform human history. It had shown that the systems and structures that seemed most permanent and most inevitable could be shattered by forces beyond human control. And yet it had also shown that humans possessed within themselves the capacity to survive, to adapt, to imagine new possibilities even in the face of catastrophe. As you lie now in your own warmth and safety, in your own comfort and security, you might reflect on the distance that separates you from that distant winter, from those people who endured the plague and the cold. You might be grateful for the medical knowledge, the technology, the systems of public health and sanitation that protect you. But you might also recognize in the story of the Black Death and the winter that amplified it as a kind of eternal truth about the human condition. We are always fragile. We are always vulnerable to forces beyond our control. Winter returns each year, bringing with it both danger and possibility. Disease still stalks humanity, still surprises us with its ability to spread and kill. But humans still possess the capacity to endure, to survive, to rebuild. The plague taught this lesson in the harshest possible terms, and the lesson remains true centuries later. The survivors of the plague, those brave souls who endured the winter of 1347 to 1348 and lived to see spring, could not have known that their descendants would inherit a world gradually transformed by their survival. They could not have known that the social upheavals they experienced would eventually contribute to the end of feudalism and the emergence of new forms of social organization. They could not have known that the intellectual crisis they experienced would eventually contribute to new ways of thinking about nature and disease that would eventually lead to modern medicine and public health. They could not have known that the spiritual questioning they endured would reshape Christian theology and contribute to new forms of religious practice and belief. They knew only the immediate reality of their own suffering, the loss of their loved ones, the cold and hunger and fear that characterized their daily existence. Yet in their survival, in their determination to continue despite everything, they laid the groundwork for all of this. They did not know they were shaping history. They only knew that they had to survive the winter, had to find food and fuel and shelter, and had to endure the plague and the grief and the trauma that came with it. And in the doing of these things, in the simple determination to continue living, they made it possible for subsequent generations to learn from their experience and to build on the foundations they had laid. As you drift now towards sleep, as the warmth of your bed surrounds you and the safety of your shelter protects you from the night and the cold, carry with you the knowledge of how fragile the threads of civilization are, how vulnerable we all are to forces beyond our control. But carry also the knowledge of human resilience, of the capacity to survive and to endure, of the possibility of finding meaning even in catastrophe. The plague came in winter, amplified by the cold and the darkness and the crowding that the season created. But humans survived it, and from their survival came change and transformation and eventually new possibilities for human flourishing. Sleep now, dear friends, in safety and comfort. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let the worries and anxieties of the day fade away. In the morning, you will wake to a world far removed from the plague and the winter of 1347 to 1348. You will be warm. You will have access to food and water and shelter. You will have access to medical knowledge and technology that would seem like magic to those medieval survivors. And yet the fundamental truths that the plague revealed about human vulnerability, about the power of nature, about the capacity for survival and resilience, remain true. Rest in this knowledge. Rest in the warmth of your shelter. Rest in the safety of knowing that countless humans before you have endured catastrophe and survived to build new worlds. The night is long, but it always passes. Winter comes, but spring always follows. The plague came, and it seemed like the end of the world, like an apocalypse. But the world continued. People survived. Life went on, transformed but continuing. And so too shall we continue, we who live so many centuries later, we who carry within ourselves the genes and the knowledge and the consciousness of those who survived the plague. We are their descendants, and we inherit both their vulnerability and their resilience. Close your eyes now. Let sleep come gently. In your dreams, perhaps you will find yourself in that distant time, walking through the cold streets of a medieval city, feeling the weight of history and the presence of those who came before. Or perhaps you will find yourself in a safe place beyond time and history, in a space where the plague cannot touch you and where the winter holds no terror. Wherever your dreams take you, go with peace and with the knowledge that you are safe, that you are warm, that you have survived another day in a long human story of survival and endurance. The winter of 1347 to 1348 was terrible, yes. But it was also a testament to human resilience, to the determination to survive, to the capacity to endure what seems unendurable. In that terrible winter, in the midst of plague and death and suffering, humans continued. They grieved, they struggled, they feared, but they continued. And from their continuation came all that followed, centuries of history, of change and transformation, of human creativity and resilience. You are part of that continuation. You inherit the strength of all those who survived, all those who endured, all those who refused to surrender to despair. Carry that inheritance with you into your sleep and into your dreams. And so our story ends, as all stories must. The plague came in winter, and the cold amplified its effects. But the survivors endured, and their endurance echoes through the centuries, reminding us of the fragility and the resilience of human life, of the power of nature to transform human history, and of the eternal possibility of survival and renewal. Sleep now, knowing that you are part of a long chain of human survival stretching back to that distant winter and extending forward into a future yet unknown. Rest well, dear friends. The night watches over you. The cold cannot reach you. You are safe. You are warm. You are home.